In this episode, we begin with a simple but powerful idea. If an organization waits until the end of an artificial intelligence (AI) project to think seriously about impact, it has already made many of the decisions that matter most. By the time a model has been chosen, data has been gathered, interfaces have been designed, and leaders have grown attached to the project, it becomes much harder to question whether the system should work this way at all. An early impact assessment helps a team pause before momentum takes over and ask what this system may do to people, processes, outcomes, and trust once it enters the real world. That early pause is not there to slow useful work for no reason. It is there to shape the design while the design is still flexible, so that risk, fairness, oversight, user experience, and legal exposure are considered before they become expensive, embarrassing, or harmful problems later. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An impact assessment is best understood as a structured effort to think through the likely effects of a proposed AI system before those effects appear in production. It is broader than a technical test and different from a simple project approval form, because it is not only asking whether the system can function. It is asking who may be affected, what kinds of harms or benefits are foreseeable, how serious those outcomes could be, how the system fits into a human workflow, and what design choices could reduce unnecessary risk before launch. That means the assessment is not only about negative possibilities, although those matter greatly. It is also about understanding the real purpose of the system, the context in which it will operate, and whether the organization's plan for using it is sensible, proportionate, and defensible. When beginners understand impact assessment this way, they stop seeing it as a compliance burden and start seeing it as one of the clearest tools for building a safer and more coherent system from the start. The word early matters because timing changes what an assessment can actually accomplish. If a team performs the assessment before major design choices are locked in, the findings can influence whether the use case should proceed, what scope should be allowed, what data should be excluded, what kind of output is appropriate, what level of automation is acceptable, and which groups require special attention. If the same assessment is performed only after development is mostly complete, the organization may still discover risks, but the available responses are narrower and often more painful. The team may need to bolt on warning labels, extra reviews, or awkward controls because the deeper design assumptions were never challenged when they could have been changed more easily. Early assessment therefore creates design freedom, while late assessment often produces defensive patchwork. That difference is one of the most important lessons in this topic, because safer design is usually the result of earlier thinking rather than better excuses after the fact. A strong assessment usually begins with the real-world problem the organization thinks it is solving, not with a model, a vendor, or a technical capability. The team needs to define the use case clearly enough to explain what the system is supposed to do, who will use it, what decisions it will influence, what inputs it will receive, and what action follows from the output. This sounds basic, but weak use case definition is one of the main reasons impact assessments fail to guide design effectively. If the purpose is vague, then the harms are vague, the safeguards are vague, and the design conversation becomes dominated by generic promises rather than specific consequences. A team that says it wants AI to improve efficiency has not yet provided enough information to assess impact meaningfully. A team that says it wants AI to help support staff triage incoming student requests for urgency, while keeping final escalation decisions with human staff, has provided something concrete enough that risks, controls, and design trade-offs can be examined in a serious way. Once the use case is clear, the next task is to identify who may be affected, and that means looking beyond the project team and direct users of the system. Some people will interact with the system directly, some will work around it, some will rely on its outputs, and some may experience its effects without ever knowing the system exists. A hiring system affects applicants who never see the model. A student support system affects learners who may not understand why certain messages receive quicker attention. A workplace system can affect employees whose opportunities, workload, or evaluations shift because managers began relying on automated signals. Early impact assessments are valuable because they force the organization to look for both direct and indirect effects before design hardens around the convenience of the builder. They also encourage the team to notice groups that may be affected differently, such as people with less typical language patterns, people with disabilities, people from different cultural backgrounds, or people whose data is less complete and therefore more likely to be handled poorly by the system. After affected groups are identified, the assessment needs to move from general concern to specific categories of possible impact. This usually includes questions about fairness, privacy, safety, autonomy, dignity, reliability, accessibility, security, and the practical opportunity people have to understand or challenge decisions shaped by the system. It is also useful to ask whether a harm would be visible right away or whether it would accumulate slowly through repeated use. Some harms are obvious, such as a dangerous recommendation, a leaked record, or an incorrect denial of service. Other harms are quieter, such as a system that subtly deprioritizes certain people, pushes workers into rubber-stamping outputs, or normalizes the use of weak signals in serious decisions because those signals seem efficient. A good early assessment brings these possibilities into the design conversation while the team still has choices. It also encourages the team to think about severity, likelihood, scale, reversibility, and the ability of affected people to recover if the system behaves poorly, because those factors help determine how strong the controls should be. Data questions belong in the assessment stage as well, because many design risks are really data risks wearing a different name. A team may assume it has clean and representative data when in reality the data reflects older practices, incomplete records, inconsistent labeling, or social patterns that should not be copied into a new system. It may assume that historical outcomes represent the right answer when those outcomes actually reflect past bias, resource shortages, or informal human judgments that were never documented properly. An early impact assessment gives the organization a chance to ask whether the proposed data is relevant to the use case, whether important groups are underrepresented, whether sensitive attributes or proxies may create unfair patterns, and whether data collection itself creates legal or ethical concerns. These questions matter before model building because the answers may change what data is used, how labels are interpreted, what features are excluded, or whether the project should rely more heavily on human judgment than originally planned. Safer design often begins with the courage to admit that the available data is not a neutral foundation. Human oversight is another design area that should be shaped by the assessment, not added as decoration later. If an assessment reveals that the system may influence important choices, create confusion, or produce errors that are hard for ordinary users to detect, then the design should include a meaningful human role with real authority and enough context to intervene. That may affect how outputs are displayed, whether confidence indicators are shown, what escalation paths exist, how much explanation is needed, and who gets the final say in edge cases. A common mistake is to assume that any human in the loop counts as adequate oversight, even when that person lacks time, training, or permission to challenge the system. Early assessment helps avoid that shallow approach by asking what the human reviewer is truly expected to do and what support they need to do it well. When that question is asked early, the workflow can be designed around real judgment rather than around the comforting appearance of human involvement. Impact findings should also shape thresholds, limits, and fallback plans. If the assessment shows that certain types of errors are especially harmful, the system may need narrower scope, stricter decision thresholds, additional review for sensitive cases, or safe defaults that slow the process down when uncertainty is high. In some cases, the best design choice is to keep the system advisory rather than allowing it to trigger an action automatically. In other cases, the right design may involve excluding a category of use entirely because the potential benefits are too small compared with the risks, or because the organization cannot supervise the system responsibly. These are design decisions, not just policy statements, and they are much easier to make when the project is still in planning. Early impact assessment creates the conditions for restraint, and restraint is often one of the clearest signs of maturity in AI governance. A team that is willing to narrow capability in order to reduce harm is often building something far more trustworthy than a team that keeps every possible feature alive simply because the technology can support it. Another important outcome of early assessment is that it improves what and how the team measures during development. If the assessment identifies certain groups, conditions, or error types as especially important, then testing can be designed to examine those areas directly rather than relying on one broad performance number. The team can define what success looks like in the real workflow and what kinds of failures should trigger redesign, extra review, or a decision not to proceed. It can also plan pilots that are narrow enough to learn safely, instead of launching widely and hoping that real users will reveal the weaknesses in a manageable way. In this sense, impact assessment is not separate from testing. It tells the team what deserves deeper testing and why. Without that guidance, evaluation often drifts toward whatever is easiest to measure, which can leave the organization confident in metrics that say very little about the harms, misunderstandings, or operational failures that matter most. Documentation becomes better when an impact assessment is done early because the organization can record not just final controls, but the reasoning that led to them. This matters because governance is stronger when someone reviewing the system later can see what risks were considered, what assumptions were made, what trade-offs were accepted, and why certain design decisions were chosen over others. If a team only documents the finished system, much of the most important thinking disappears, and future reviewers may not understand whether the system was built carefully or merely defended after the fact. Early documentation of impact thinking also makes updates easier when the use case changes, the user population expands, or new concerns appear during operation. Instead of starting from zero, the organization has a record of its original judgments and can compare them against what it has learned over time. This supports accountability, but it also supports institutional memory, which is especially valuable when staff change roles or when a system remains in use longer than the original project team expected. A well-run assessment is also iterative rather than frozen. The early version is important because it shapes design, but it should not be treated as a one-time document that permanently settles every question. As the system is developed, piloted, and later used in practice, the organization may discover that some assumptions were wrong, some harms were less significant than expected, and others were more serious or more widespread. New user groups may arrive, data may change, workflows may shift, and people may begin using the system in ways that were foreseeable but not originally emphasized. A mature program therefore treats the early assessment as the first major version, not the last. That mindset protects against one of the most common failures in governance, which is believing that careful thinking at the beginning eliminates the need for careful thinking later. The earlier assessment shapes safer design decisions, but it also creates the baseline that later reviews can challenge, refine, and improve as reality reveals what the initial planning missed. Several common mistakes become easier to avoid once you understand what early impact assessment is supposed to do. One mistake is treating it like a legal form to complete after the real design work has already happened. Another is focusing only on worst-case disaster while ignoring slower, cumulative harms that emerge through routine use, such as over-reliance, exclusion, or the quiet erosion of meaningful human judgment. A third mistake is involving only the technical team, which often leaves out the people who understand the business process, the affected population, or the operational constraints that determine whether the system will actually be safe and useful. A fourth mistake is writing the assessment at such a high level that it never influences concrete choices about data, interfaces, thresholds, fallback procedures, or scope. When these mistakes happen, the assessment becomes ceremonial rather than practical. The real goal is to use the assessment to improve the system before the system improves the organization's confidence in a bad design. A simple example can make the value of early assessment easier to hear. Imagine a college considering an AI tool to help identify student messages that may need urgent support. If the school begins with an early impact assessment, it may realize that the tool should not decide outcomes on its own, that certain language patterns could be misread, that students from different backgrounds may express distress differently, and that human staff need clear escalation rules for uncertain cases. It may also realize that false negatives could be far more serious than a moderate number of false positives, which would shape threshold choices, review procedures, and pilot design. If the school skips that assessment until after the system is built, It may discover the same issues only after staff have already organized their workflow around the tool and trust has already formed around its outputs. The assessment did not merely identify risk. It changed the design early enough that the system could be made narrower, safer, and more realistic before deployment momentum made those changes harder to accept. By the end of this topic, the central lesson should feel very clear. Impact assessments are most valuable when they happen early enough to influence what the system becomes, not just to describe what the system already is. They help organizations define the use case properly, identify affected stakeholders, examine foreseeable harms, question data assumptions, design real oversight, choose meaningful controls, guide testing, strengthen documentation, and set up later review with a stronger starting point. Early assessment is not anti-innovation, and it is not a sign that the organization lacks confidence in its ideas. It is a sign that the organization understands that safer design comes from earlier scrutiny, clearer reasoning, and a willingness to shape the system before the system starts shaping people. That is why this practice matters so much in AI governance. When impact thinking begins early, design decisions become more careful, more defensible, and much more likely to support trustworthy outcomes in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.